All right, folks, let's get into this one. We just saw a story that Russian warships are entering into the Red Sea. Now, here's something very interesting. By the time you watch this video, this news story will be roughly 2 days old, yet it's very likely that many of you may have not even heard the story. Not because it's not true, but because there's probably not a lot of analysis regarding what's actually happening being put in front of people, because some of this stuff can be very difficult to understand. The other thing that I want to also mention is if you are watching this video, and let's say you're watching this video 6 months from the time of the story, this is still going to be very important for you, because what we're going to do is provide some analysis of the story. We're going to go over the story first, and then I'm going to provide some analysis that will better help you to understand why this becomes so transcendent with respect to time, and why this is very important to not just the Ezekiel narrative that we read about that's going to be happening in the future, but why this is so important to understanding the geopolitics, not just of the Middle East, but of course, Europe and Russia. So there's a lot to talk about here and a lot to get into, but we just have to simply start by getting into the story. The story is really critical here, so let's do that really quick. And the story starts off very simply. It says here, the Houthis have vowed to continue their attacks in the Red Sea as long as Israel continues to commit crimes against Palestinians. That's what they're calling it, right? And I don't understand why they're actually making this the sort of the subtitle of the heading of the news story. But let's get into this and we'll talk about this. Here's the article. The article says several Russian warships have passed the Bab al-Mandab Strait into the Red Sea, the Russian Navy's Pacific Fleet said on Thursday, amid attacks by Yemeni Houthis on merchant shipping. The Zvezda TV channel, owned by the defense ministry, this is Russia's defense ministry, quoted the fleet as saying the Russian cruiser Varyag and the frigate Marshal Sefashnikov were taking part in the voyage. Houthi terrorists in Yemen have repeatedly attacked ships passing through the Bab al-Mandab Strait in the Red Sea since November in support of Palestinians. And this is interesting. They claim they're doing this in support of Palestinians, but the reality of it is they're not supporting Palestinians. Who they're supporting actually is Iran. And of course, this brings us to understanding a little bit of context, because by the way, this story with respect to Russia is pretty much all we have right now. There isn't much that's being developed outside of this. And I think it's really important for us to understand, because when we take it a little deeper, then it's going to help sort of illuminate some of what's going on. So first and foremost, we have to talk about what is actually going on in the southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, okay? So we are talking about, of course, Yemen. And of course, if you were to look at a map of Saudi Arabia, in the southern portion of Saudi Arabia, you have Yemen. Of course, Oman is also on the southern portion. And if you go further towards the Persian Gulf, you'll start seeing other countries, of course, like Bahrain or, all the different countries that are in the Persian Gulf. We're not going to talk about that because we just simply don't have the time to talk about that. But one of the things that we should have a discussion concerning is the current state of affairs with respect to Yemen. Right now, Yemen is in a bit of a civil war, which of course makes sense because that civil war has made way for a lot of insanity with respect to the presence of terrorist organizations within the country. And the most significant of the terrorist organizations in the country are the Yemeni Houthis. Now, they are directly influenced and in many ways controlled by Tehran. Of course, we're talking about Iran. And they are one of the most active proxies of Iran in the southern Arabian Peninsula. By the way, there are other organizations near or around the Arabian Peninsula that would functionally identify themselves as being proxies of Iran, but the ones of real consequence are the Yemenis. Why? Because they affect what happens in the Gulf of Aden, which is to the south of the Yemenis border. Okay, remember, the southern Yemenis border has the Gulf of Aden that's right there, which of course takes you further in. If you go further south, it takes you into the Indian Ocean. If you go further east, it takes you over to the Arabian Sea. And if you go even more east and you go north and then you go back west, it takes you into the Persian Gulf. So it's important to kind of understand the geography here, but the Yemenis are very much affecting what is going on all throughout what's happening in the water body that is below Yemen, and of course, or to the south of Yemen, and of course, to the west of Yemen. And as we talked about further across the peninsula into the Persian Gulf, there's a lot of things that it affects here. And of course, it gets even more significant when you go further north through the Red Sea into, of course, this area where we begin to see the Suez Canal and so on and so forth. Now, all the countries that are affected by the behavior of these Yemeni Houthis significantly are first and foremost Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia becomes the most affected by this, but all of the other countries that surround this are very much affected, right? The UAE is affected, Oman is affected, Somalia, believe it or not, is affected, Ethiopia is affected, Eritrea is affected, Djibouti is affected, all of these countries that are around. The Sudan is affected, certainly Egypt is affected, and believe it or not, even Jordan is affected, because when you look at the southern border of Jordan, you are dealing with Saudi Arabia, and it has a significant effect on what happens with them, especially when we begin to deal with Riyadh security in Saudi Arabia. And of course, as you go further west from Riyadh into Mecca and Medina, it also presents some very serious problems. Now, the most significant of the problems that we're facing right now with the Yemeni Houthis happens to be the activity that they are beginning to arouse even more within the Red Sea, and it is becoming a major disruption to a lot of the vessels that are going through that area in order to affect trade and many of the other things that are going on, because, of course, one of the major trade routes for countries like India, Pakistan, and all of those areas is to go through the Arabian Sea into the Gulf of Aden, going through this little Mendeb Strait up into the Red Sea, all throughout into the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean and across the way. This is their path because they don't want to take the ocean and go all the way south of the African continent and around that area and go through. It just makes a much more difficult way to do things. And of course, it's important to understand why all of this is happening the way it's happening, because understand the Houthis are on behalf of Iran trying to make a statement against Israel because of what Israel is doing, what they say Israel is doing. And of course, they want the rest of the world that has any economic interest that surround the Red Sea and of course surround the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean to be sympathizers with their cause, because they want to manipulate the circumstance or the situation. Now, this is where it gets puzzling, okay? Russia is going through, they have to be going through a whole ton of trouble to end up where they're ending up in the Red Sea. My guess is this. My guess is Russia had some assets in the Mediterranean. Russia probably still had some assets in the Gulf of Guinea, which should not be a surprise to anybody. And of course, for those of you that might not know that area, we are actually talking about the western section of the African continent, just south of Nigeria, okay? And that's kind of an important aspect to be considering. And then it should also be understood that they probably took those assets from there around the bottom of the African continent and further north up into probably resting around the Somalia coast for a little while and then positioning themselves into the Red Sea. Now, with all of that, I'm probably giving a little bit too much information as into maybe more than what you want to tolerate, as into how they got there. But the reality of it is they are there not to create a enhanced security interest with respect to fending off the Houthis, because if the Houthis recognize any type of a Russian vessel, they will not attack that Russian vessel. The reason why they won't attack that Russian vessel is because the Russians are close to Iran and, of course, understand the Houthis are functional proxies of Iran and in some cases are going to be very submissive or subservient to the wishes of Russia, not necessarily directly because there's some type of a diplomatic, for lack of a better term, relationship between Yemen and Russia, but because Russia and Iran are close, and anything that has anything to do with the Houthis not touching Russia is going to be related to Tehran's action at the plea of Putin. So why does this become significant? It becomes significant for several reasons. Number one, you have to consider the port position that is sitting in Sudan, okay? This shouldn't be a surprise to a lot of people because in the Sudan, when you start looking at the coast off of Sudan, Russia does have assets there, okay? Significant assets, because that happened when they created a base and when they began to establish relationships with Saudi Arabia. The one thing that we have to understand with respect to Saudi Arabia, and this is very, very critical to recognize and to know, is when you are looking at Saudi Arabia, they have a formal arms agreement with Russia, and much of the arms that they receive from Russia get delivered to them from the ports that exist in the Sudan because of what's happening right now with Russia and Libya. Why am I saying that? Because one of the pathways that Russia is delivering weapons and all kinds of stuff into Libya is through Sudan, completely avoiding Egypt, completely avoiding going through the Suez Canal and from the top of the Mediterranean coast on Tripoli, and going straight through the country of Sudan into Libya to actually win the civil war that's going on, which brings us to the main issue here. And that is the fact that there is a civil war that is going on right now in between two factions in Libya, and the one faction that is winning is the one that is being controlled by Russia. And if Russia takes possession of all of that territory, then Russia will produce for itself one of the most significant and powerful positions in the Mediterranean, and that is they will have control of all of the southern Mediterranean coast, with, of course, the exception of Egypt and part of Tunisia. The funny thing about this is nobody's going to move on Russia when Russia takes its more prominent role in Libya, because they're already there, and it would be very, very difficult to launch a war against Russia on multiple fronts. So this is very important stuff to understand and know, and the analysis behind this becomes significant because if Russia is beginning to be more active in its positioning in the Red Sea, then it means that they are anticipating action in Libya, not in Israel, but more so in Libya, and that tells us things are about to change rapidly. And when I say rapidly, I mean rapidly in the area of the Mediterranean, the southern Mediterranean specifically, and we may very well begin to see some strengthening and positioning of the alliance that we read about in Ezekiel 38, specifically with the actions of Sudan and what Russia is doing in Sudan and where things may go as we further progress in all of this. One thing is certain, a lot of these movements that we're watching right now shouldn't surprise us. They are changing the geopolitics of the region, and another thing that it's doing is it is very much putting a whole bunch of people on notice. Things are going to start slowing down with respect to the aggression against Russia because people are beginning to recognize the writing on the wall. What's happening in Ukraine right now is going to become less and less of a problem for Russia because the international community is starting to lose interest in all of this very quickly, because undoubtedly, especially NATO, do not want to see themselves fall apart and be destroyed because it's already splintering, and there's a whole bunch of other things that are going on. Perhaps the biggest and most significant of all of those variables is the energy problem that we're seeing in Europe, and that energy problem can only be solved by Russian assets and potentially Israeli assets with the permission of Russia. So there's a lot happening. Syria has something to play in this because it becomes sort of the staging ground for Russia, which also becomes a major issue for us when we start looking at what's going on in Turkey, as Erdogan is continuing to drill in that little portion of the Mediterranean that is what we would call the northeast portion of the Mediterranean. And so this is north of Cyprus and a little bit to the east. All of this is really important. And then with the crisis that is lingering in Beirut, with the economics that are happening over there and what's taking place with Hezbollah and the potential for some real war with Israel, you have a powder keg just waiting to explode. But this gives you sort of a good, very precursory view of some of the things that's happening and what's going through my head when I start looking at the region. A lot to be said there. There's a lot to talk about. There's a whole lot to talk about, but I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a lay of the land as into why this might be significant and some of the analysis that drives all of this. It's pretty important stuff. So with that, guys, keep your eyes open, pay attention to the headlines, read the Bible, study it. The Bible's going to give you all the insight that you need to know about what's happening in this region and what's happening really in essence all over the world. We know that Christ could come at any moment. We're watching things begin to change so dramatically and radically. And folks, it's right here in front of us. Lots of good info. God is just literally laying it out the way he said he would. Pretty amazing stuff. All right. Love you guys. God bless you.